Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christos was his benedict, smertis verbum, Iisus regnebit darabam. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. God bless you. Okay, I want to start off with any questions, and also if anybody has any questions about what they're reading in the book. Especially any questions from last week.
I wanted to ask about the priestly connection that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Margaret Barker that suggested that the priestly sect of Jews came along to the Christian side, or?
No, it was the Apostle Luke.
Apostle Luke.
In the book of Acts.
Huh.
And that's an important thing. It's not just, scholarly surmise. It's an actual, it's an actual fact. And really, if you look, there were two very distinct kinds of Judaism. There was the Judaism that was focused on the temple, and the Judaism that was focused on the synagogue. And the Jews who went to the synagogue did, at the time of Jesus, continue to go to the temple, but they were mainly rooted in the synagogue and the study of the law and the prophets and so forth. Whereas the people whose lives were focused around the temple, and it was the daily cycle of services at the temple, the morning and evening services, the sacrifices, and the very intricate festal calendar. Judaism, our calendar is a kind of a morphing of the Jewish calendar, and so there are a lot of elements that remain the same. What happened with us, though, is you have the very most kind of primitive agricultural calendar. The basic time for planting, time for first fruits, time for harvest, time for when everything is fallow, and then and the celebrations of that, and then there was another level laid on by in the temple of interpreting those things in a religious way, and then there was another level laid on that, and then finally the Christian level, so that you have our cycle of the feasts and the fasts, but a lot of it is still connected. But you got to remember too that it's the connection belongs to the geopolitical locus of Palestine, which is a warm, temperate Mediterranean climate. The focal point is not Russia. It's not Italy. It's not any place else. It's Palestine. So everything is, but then it's interesting to say, for example, how probably they would plant at Pascha in Palestine. That's my guess, or even earlier, because there wouldn't be any frost. Well, of course, often at Pascha in Russia, you still have 4 feet of snow on the ground, and so the planting cycle, and it's all connected between the lunar cycle and the solar cycle, would be at a different time, and there were other feasts, for example, other things that were adapted to that. So we can go into we'll go into that later on. But the temple had had its own very distinct cycle of services, and its own kind of ethos. And so already by the time of Jesus there was a divide between the groups that were focused on the temple, the groups that rejected the temple, the new temple, and then those that accepted the temple, and those that accepted the Roman rule, and those that were fighting against the Roman rule, those that accepted the whole kind of religion that came out of Babylon, the synagogues and rabbis and the rabbinic tradition, and those who really didn't. And so Judaism was a very complex thing. There was no such thing as Orthodox Judaism. And so when the church arose, it arose within Judaism. And it only after the fall of the temple did it ultimately kind of split from Judaism. Was it ultimately rejected by Judaism? But I think it's quite a legitimate speculation to think that a great bulk of the Jews became Christians, or a great bulk of those who call themselves, Jews or Hebrews. So,
like 5% or 60%?
Probably more like 60.
Okay.
Like 60. Of course, it would vary in different places. Outside of Palestine, of course, you didn't have the temple. It was all the Pharisaic kind of rabbinic tradition, and there were synagogues all over the place, all over the Roman Empire, because there were Jewish populations all over the Roman Empire. And especially after the fall of the temple and the diaspora of the Jews, because the Romans sent most of the Jews away from Palestine. They took their religion and their scriptures with them. So Judaism was expanding its presence at the same time as the church was expanding. What else?
A question that actually comes from the book, and it ties somehow to what you're saying, Vladika, and our first lesson, which is, I think the book titles it the call. Why is it that some of us would hear something and feel that call, and some would not? And that ties primarily onto how the rational mind would link to our spiritual consciousness. Can you elaborate a little bit more of how and why this happens to some and not to others?
Well, I don't think we can say why. Mm-hmm. Hearing the call is the opening of our spiritual consciousness. Some people either don't understand it, or don't want it, or don't accept it, or they're unconscious of it. But for those of us who hear the word, who hear it and respond, and in turn respond with a dedication of our whole life, that's this is the Lord's parable. The seed that falls on good ground, the seed that falls on the path, the seed that falls in the rocks, and the seed that falls in the thorns. Mm-hmm. The seed is cast, and in fact, they were actually throwing the seed into the field. But what kind of ground is it on, and how have we prepared that ground? If we live lives completely according to carnality, and then we're probably not going to be we probably won't hear the word unless we know that, that there's something, unless we feel the emptiness that brings. So each person is predisposed by his or her life, to respond. And some will hear the word with gladness, and others will hear the word as they have a sense of shame and guilt and condemnation. With each person it varies.
Like in prison cells, some people go to prison and find God, and some go and actually become completely embittered. And yeah, we have lots of examples.
May I ask, are you going to be assigning reading, or is it just go ahead on your own pace?
Let's go ahead on your own pace. Okay, anything else? Okay, well last week we pretty much covered the different kind of texts of the scriptures, especially this whole problem of the Septuagint versus the Masoretic text, right? Is everybody pretty clear on that, and that the Church uses the Masoretic text, or uses the Septuagint as the foundation for its liturgical life and for most of its theology? It's the text of the Old Testament that the Fathers used. In English, it's hard to find the Septuagint text. Now there was a text called the Douay Rheims, which was a translation from the Latin. The Septuagint was translated into Latin, and then it was translated into English. Well, it's still a Septuagint-based translation, albeit kind of secondhand. There are some new translations, and one thing that's useful is the Orthodox Study Bible takes and interpolates some of the most of the Septuagint readings into the text. So it's not a new translation entirely, but it's better than picking up a typical Protestant Bible in a Bible bookstore. And also, it's probably better than using the Old King James, especially for readability. If you're going to use it liturgically, probably the Old King James is good, where it's where there's an accurate translation. There are now many translations of the pericopes, which is what you call the passage that's taken from the actual scriptures and used in the service. So, for example, on Vespers on a feast day, there will be 3 pericopes from the Old Testament, right? Okay. Most of those have been separately translated. There is one version called the Orthodox Bible coming out of Colorado. Unfortunately, it reads like somebody's Greek homework. It's super literal, which I think can often miss the point. I think what we need to consider now is, how do we read the Bible? Now, it's often said that the Orthodox don't study the Bible, and that's probably true. But there's a difference between studying the Bible in an academic way and reading the Scriptures in a prayerful way. And the difference is immense. On one hand, you're critiquing the text. On the other hand, the text is critiquing you. And the way we really need to read it is for the text to critique me, and not for me to figure out what I like or don't like about the text. Because the text is there, it's given, it's a given, and it's ultimately that by which we need to measure our lives, and that by which we need to measure our spiritual life. One of the most important ways of doing this was given to us by the monastic tradition. In the West, it's a highly developed kind of a method called Lectio Divina, and what it is, and it was developed in Benedictine monasteries in the first millennium. You find it also in Byzantine and in Syriac monasticism, almost identical, but it's not quite so systematized. And the West was really good about systematization, the Greeks were not. But what it is that you read a passage several times, a short passage, say the daily reading, and you kind of chew on it for a while. You think about it, you enter into it, and then you pray the passage like you would a passage from a prayer book, or a prayer in a prayer book, and let it sink in. And then if there's a particular phrase or a word in that passage, you take that and repeat it several times to yourself, kind of turning it over and over. You know, what is it that you see as God speaking to you in a particular passage? Where do you see that particular passage critiquing your life? And asking yourself, how am I living up to this passage in the scriptures, or am I living up to it? Am I taking it seriously? So it's this constant, or it's this meditation on the scriptural text. But then it moves from that meditation on the text, which is always, meditation is in this sense is always focused around a specific phrase or a specific passage. It moves to contemplation, and what you do is you take that text and you sit with it in silence and let it penetrate in. And you may sit there for 30 seconds, you may sit there for 2 hours with the text. But you can see it's a very different way of approaching a text than an academic, where you would sit down, you would analyze it, you would look up all the Greek words, look at what, their grammatical particularities, and look up everything. That has value in and of itself. But that's not the kind of study of the scriptures which we base our spiritual life around.
What was the name you gave that?
Lectio Divina.
Did you define that again?
Divine reading.
And that's what you were just talking about,
right?
Meditating, contemplating.
Yeah.
What's the difference between meditation and contemplation, if I may ask?
Hold on. Meditation is basically centered around the text. Contemplation is focused on God. In meditation, the text is the subject of your meditation. In contemplation, God is the subject.
No, you said,
Or rather, actually, in meditation, the text is the object. In contemplation, God initially is the object, but then becomes the subject.
Did I understand, obviously this is Latin,
Mm-hmm.
and you said this was a Benedictine type of discipline?
It was developed in a kind of in a systematic way by the early Benedictine fathers, who were Orthodox, by the way. It was just in Latin, but it was
Mm-hmm.
they were as Orthodox as anybody else.
When did Saint Benedict live?
6th century, I think.
Okay.
So, and Benedictine monasticism basically has retained much of its ancient character. Now, one of the things I think everybody's probably heard of are some of these academic dissections of the scriptures. The Jesus Seminar, everybody's heard about that, where they go through and they decide which passages really belong to Jesus and which passages don't, and how the whole thing was put together. And we don't pay much attention to that in the Orthodox Church. For us, the Scripture derives its authority from the Church. And this is very important. The Church came first. The Church is not based on the Scriptures. The Scriptures come out of the life of the Church. The Scriptures of the book are the book of the Church. They were written, edited, and published by the Church. And those who are outside the Church, we let them use them. You know, we share. But ultimately, the context of the Scriptures is the liturgical life of the Church. And that's the liturgical life of the Church is its primary context of interpretation. Now, one of the kind of fundamental precepts of American Protestantism is that everybody can understand and interpret the Scriptures for themselves. We reject that. We have to understand the Scriptures in the context of the Church. And this is kind of where we're going on this. That includes all the hymnography and all of the services and how the Scriptures are used in the services and in the prayers and in the texts that the Church uses, in the sacraments, how they're because Scriptures are read during the celebration of the sacraments, and so there's a usually there's a connection, like the baptism. You know, at baptism, what's read? I mean, the baptism of Jesus, right? And then the Romans passage from the interpretation of Paul's interpretation of baptism. Marriage, what's read? The wedding of Cana in Galilee, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
We all know that from the time that the canon was determined until Gutenberg invented the printing press, there were not tons of Bibles floating around. No. Average Orthodox Christians did not have a copy of the Bible at home. So correct me if I'm wrong, being new to this, originally there were services every day that the people went to.
Yeah.
And their exposure to the Bible was through the services, what they listened, what they heard, because a lot of them were illiterate anyway. They wouldn't have been able to handle
90%.
Yes. So these people were illiterate. They didn't have a copy of it, and if they had, they couldn't have read it. So their total exposure to the Scripture was at the church service.
Right, exactly.
Now, did back then, or you know, and I'm not sure if things are exactly the same today. I know a lot of things are, but did they actually go through the whole Bible? I mean, I know that on Sundays we know that every year there's going to be Lazarus Sunday. You know, there's certain passages that you get every year, but there's a lot of the Bible that you don't get.
Right.
Now, was that other part of the Bible covered during these daily services back then, or if not, then were there large parts of the Bible that people just never knew or learned about?
Well, there are several different aspects of how the Scriptures are used in the services. One, you have the lectionary, but the lectionary is composed of the Gospel readings, the Acts and the Epistles, and then sections from the wisdom books and the prophets and from the law, which were mostly done. The Old Testament was mostly done at Vespers, and then during Lent, during the hours, and then you had the Gospels and the Epistles at the Divine Liturgy. Now, in many places, the Divine Liturgy was celebrated daily, and if you read almost the entire New Testament is read during the daily readings of the liturgy. So if you keep up with your daily readings, you may miss a few verses here and there, but not much. And you'll read through the entire New Testament in 1 year. And there are seasons, for example. The season of Pascha to Pentecost is the season of the Gospel of John. And then it moves into Mark, and then into Matthew, and then it moves into Luke, and then it picks up with some of Mark, and then it kind of picks up a bunch of other things as we move into Lent, and then there are the set readings during Lent, and of course in the weekdays of Lent they don't do epistle and gospel readings because there's no divine liturgy. So the emphasis is on the prophets and on Isaiah and Proverbs, and then Ezekiel and Job during Holy Week. So you've got the reading. So the New Testament would probably 95% of the New Testament, with the exception of the Book of Revelation, is read during the liturgical year. The Book of Revelation was always a question mark in the Eastern Church. There were evidently one of the battles over the canon was that the Western Church was pushing the Book of the Revelation, and the Eastern Church was pushing the Book of Hebrews, which is anonymous, technically. We regard it as having been written by St. Paul, but in reality, it's the actual book itself is anonymous. And the Book of Revelation was always viewed as too esoteric to be read on a regular basis. Now, the Latin Church includes the Book of the Revelation in their lectionary. The Coptic Church, and this is very interesting, reads it on Holy Saturday, whereas we read the Book of Acts, they read it on Holy Saturday from the Vesperal liturgy until the midnight liturgy of Pascha.
They read it at the tomb, like we read
Yeah.
Acts at the tomb.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I think which I think is actually a pretty wonderful practice, and that really gives it its right context. Revelation is an extremely complex book, one of the reasons that it's not read and very little commented upon is because it was always considered that it was way too complex for the average person to, including the average priest, to be able to comment on. In fact, there's also a rule somewhere that was that you have to be at least 30 years old to read the Book of Revelation. Now, 30 years old, 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, was old. It was more like, people died at 45. So, or 50. So you had to be, it meant somebody who was very mature. So there's that. You look at, and then the Old Testament. Vespers used to have a daily readings from the Old Testament, from the Law and the Prophets, and from the wisdom literature. That eventually got reduced down to the feasts, to fairly high-ranking feasts. Then there was, but still, it was a few major books were the focus: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Genesis and Exodus, and then there are bits and pieces from the historical books, and then of course the book of Proverbs, the book of the wisdom of Solomon, and Ecclesiasticus. Now the Psalms is I didn't mention that because there's an aspect of it that's read like a lectionary, and and then it's used in an entirely different way. In the early church, especially in monasticism, if the monks were able to read, the expectation was that they would memorize the entire book of Psalms. And that was their daily rule, that they would recite the entire book of Psalms from memory.
Daily?
Daily. And that's still the rule in the Egyptian church, in the Coptic church. Only in the Coptic church they cheat, kind of, because they'll have, if there's 10 monks in the monastery, they'll all gather into in the chapel, and each one will recite his 10% of the Psalter all at the same time. So,
woe to you if there's only one monk in the monastery. Huh?
Oh yeah, well, you better be a hermit then, because all you're going to be doing is reading the book of Psalms. One of the reasons the Jesus prayer developed so strongly is because most of the monks were illiterate, and so instead of reciting the Psalms, they would certainly get to know some just from memorization by hearing, but for the most part they would use the Jesus prayer because they couldn't read. So the Psalms eventually, the book of the Psalms in Byzantine usage came to be divided into 20 sections called kathismas. Kathisma means time to sit down. That's what the word means. And so if you go to most normal Orthodox monasteries, everybody sits down during the reading of the Psalter. And so then, pardon?
I'm sorry, a light bulb's going on. I'm like, oh.
So that's what's going on.
Yeah.
As they're mumbling in Greek, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so during Vespers, there's one section is read, and during Matins, 2 sections are read. And during Lent, it's all changed around because the rule became, in the Byzantine church, instead of going through the Psalter once a day, you went through it once a week. And so, for example, we sing "Blessed is the Man" on Saturday night, right? Well, "Blessed is the Man" is selected verses from the first third of the first kathisma of the Psalter. And if you go to some monasteries, they may sing those verses, but then they read the rest of the verses in between, and so they'll be, it'll alternate reading and singing until they get to the other 2/3, the other two sections, because each section, of the Kathisma is divided into 3, and then they'll just read the others. And that way you get through the Book of the Psalter once a week, and twice a week during Lent, according to this particular form. Now, if you've paid attention to the services of the daily cycle, Matins, Vespers, Compline, 1st, 3rd, and 6th, and 9th hours, and midnight office, right? They're almost entirely composed of psalms. Now, and then there are a few hymns that are inserted. Now, very early in the earliest phase of the life of the church, especially when monasticism was just beginning, the monks were adamant that they didn't want all sorts of composed hymnography. If they were going to sing to God, they were going to use the scriptures, and so the services were basically composed of the Psalms, and then in Matins you have 9 biblical odes, sections from various books that are taken and read, they're poetic in nature, and they basically are, they ultimately refer to the resurrection. And so, for example, those are only read now in monasteries for the most part, or I guess here probably during Lent. You'll hear these long readings from the Old Testament during Matins, for daily Matins, and then with verses interpolated later on. But so, for example, and then eventually the scriptural material got left off, and they just do the verses, and that's not, as we call it, the canon. And so, for example, the Irmos, which is the first verse, it's a whole special set of Triparia, always refers somehow to that scriptural ode. So, for example, it almost always refers to the Red Sea, crossing the Red Sea. The 9th ode is the Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Lord, the Song of Mary, and the Song of Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. So there's 2 New Testament odes, but the other 8 are from the Old Testament. There's the song of the 3 children, and remember in the Paschal Canon where it says, where it quotes Isaiah, "The dead shall arise, those in the tombs shall awake." Well, that's in that particular ode. It's where that quotation is found, and so it's using the scriptural text as hymnography. A little bit later, so this is like through the 6th century. This late 5th, early 6th century, they began to develop a form of liturgical poetry called Cantakia. And what we call an akathist is an ancient Cantakian. Now, you can imagine the services would be very long if you sang an akathist in the middle of Matins, right? Matins already, even without the scriptural odes, already takes a couple of hours, right? Well, it would take another hour if you sang the Cantakian. But that was how that was where it began to develop. Then the canons developed and all this other stuff. So you have the scripture being used in multiple ways as the text, as the fixed text of the service. Then there are interpretive hymns that are part of the fixed text of the service. For example, Vespers. There are two major interpretive hymns. One is a composition, and one is scriptural. What are they? Vespers.
Psalm 103.
No, that's not an interpretive hymn or a composition.
Awesome.
Ask the question again.
Okay, in Vespers,
Right.
there are two key short hymns that are not. One of them is a poetic composition, and the other is a quotation from the New Testament. What are they?
Now let us throw thy servant to depart in peace.
That's right. That's one. And what's the other one? What's the Vespers hymn?
Oh, gentle light.
Yeah.
Oh, right, a gladsome light.
Gladsome light.
Gladsome.
Svetitiki. Okay. Svetitiki was written by the Patriarch Sophronius, but it probably draws on earlier texts that are very similar. It was the lamplighting hymn. So, it talks when Saint Basil, in one of his compositions, talks about his sister lighting the lamps and singing the lamp lighting hymn. It was probably Fosse Leron, or something like it. And then the Song of Simeon, "Now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace." That's just a quotation. It's a short hymn from the New Testament. What are the key hymns in Matins? What's the longest major composed hymn in Matins?
The Great Doxology.
Yeah, Great Doxology. And these are completely geared to the daily cycle. So what does the priest say right before the Great Doxology? Glory to thee who has shown us the light. Now, with the timing of the service, when do you think Matins was supposed to be begun?
At dawn?
Dawn.
Before dawn. And then it gets time, so the glory to thee who has shown us the light is as the sun is coming up.
So is that why some monasteries start their matins like at
At 4 in the morning.
4 in the morning?
And at Vespers. Now that we have come to the setting of the sun, okay, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So so in our liturgical usage, it's pretty weird to sing Vespers in the morning and Matins in the evening, because it's out of kilter, right? But well, we do.
Why do some monasteries have their liturgy in the middle of the night?
Because the liturgy is actually there is no set time for the liturgy. It can be done at various times. There's a kind of customary time, which is after the 6th hour. But many places, in many monasteries, what they'll do is they'll have Matins at 2 o'clock in the morning. They'll start at 2 o'clock in the morning, or midnight office, and just go through all the way through liturgy. That means midnight office, Matins, 1st, 3rd, 6th hour, and finally liturgy.
And that's
In
how
a
many hours?
4-hour or 5-hour block.
Right.
Most of the monasteries that do that, most of the brothers aren't there for most of it.
The Coptic church has that. They have the midnight hour every week.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's prescribed for us too. Midnight office.
Yeah, it's a beautiful service.
Yeah. Now we just went through Holy Week. What's the main theme hymn from the midnight office? Think of the first 3 days of Holy Week. What kind of Matins did you go through?
The bridegroom.
Right. Behold, the bridegroom comes at
Midnight.
midnight. And blessed is he whom he will find watching, and worthy is he whom he will find heedless, but beware therefore. You know, referring to the scripture, to the story in the gospel, right? You know, and then even for the hours, you have there's, for example, O Lord, who at the third hour did send on the most Holy Spirit. Okay, and then at you know, at the sixth hour it talks about the crucifixion, at the ninth hour about the death of Jesus. So it's all, you know, it's all tied to the actual times during the day. Now, one of the things that's generally not done in the Orthodox world is that you've generally, except for by converts, is that you don't usually do the hours separately during the day. It's not you don't. It's not like you do the first hour is 6 a.m. So it's not like you do the first hour at 6, the ninth hour at or the third hour at 9, the sixth hour at noon, and the ninth hour at 3. That's generally not done. They're usually grouped together. Otherwise, nobody would get any work done. That's the practical side of things.
Well, and that was a question I was wondering. Back in the first millennium, when there was an agrarian society and people had to work, you know, from sun up to sundown, just about, how did they manage to be in church for these multiple services for many long hours?
Well, the services, I don't know. See, the services as we have them now developed in monasteries. There are two major centers. One was in Palestine, the monastery of St. Sabas, and the other center was in Constantinople, the Studite monastery. Yeah, of course, there were in the early church. Every major center had its own order of services, and they varied to greater or lesser degrees. You know, this kind of making the services uniform across the entire Orthodox world, which has happened, came with the printing press. You know, because they printed one version of the Typicon, and then they printed thousands of copies. Well, and who's going to typeset all the other versions of the Typicon, especially at that time? And so things became very much more uniform. For example, in the Russian Church, for the first 300 years, they didn't use the St. Sabas Typicon. They used the Studite Typicon, which is quite different in certain things. So, but in the early church, you know, the first 500 or 600 years, there would undoubtedly be some kind of morning service in church, you know, consisting of psalms and prayers and hymns, and maybe the Eucharistic liturgy. And then people would they would come to that, and then they would go to work. And they would end their day by going to Vespers. And when you experience that cycle, it's a fantastic thing. It's a wonderful thing. And when you're used to it, and when you don't have it, it's like horrible. You know, you feel like your day is without structure.
Are there places outside of monasteries where that cycle is still followed?
There are parishes that do the full daily cycle.
The Romanian monasteries.
The monasteries mostly all do it. You know, unless you have a little tiny monastery, and then it's probably beyond their strength. But but the daily cycle is normal. And quite frankly, in America, we're lazy. Because the basic job of the priest is to do the daily cycle of services. And so every parish, almost every parish, every urban parish you go to, and most, I would bet, in Russia and Ukraine and Romania and Serbia, in Greece, there's matins in the morning, and there's vespers in the evening, and there's probably liturgy after matins. Often and usually on a daily basis. And so this, our orthodoxy is gravely impoverished in this country. Because we don't hear the full scriptural readings. When I first started the monastery, most of the people who came were right essentially out of the world. They were either hippies out of the woods or kids right out of college or something like that, who didn't know a whole lot. And after 1 year on the kleros, in other words, 1 year in being involved in singing the services and trying to figure out how to put it all together, and they had a full catechism. Because the services are, and that's the liturgical ethos of the Orthodox services. That it's this complete exposition of the faith through the services. Now there's another aspect which is an incredibly complex topic and one well worthy of investigation, is that the scriptures are not only interpreted by the words of the services, but by the iconography. And so the people, one of the reasons we have churches that are so splendidly adorned is so that people can go in and read the scriptures, even if they're illiterate. They can go in and they can see the scriptures. They can see the life of Jesus. They can see the life of the saints. They can, and they can contemplate it. And it's something, and it's extremely powerful. Through the painted word. Now we have. Okay, so we have all these various ways the scripture is used in the services. Then there's the interpretive hymnography, which is what which comes in there's a couple of different levels of it. You've got the text of the daily cycle, and so that's. Day starts at Vespers, Compline, Midnight Office, Matins, and then First, Third, Sixth, and Ninth Hour. During the hours and in other words, the services are divided into two kind of classes. One are the liturgical services, and the other are kind of, you could almost say, non-liturgical. In other words, you use the altar and open the royal doors for Vespers and Matins, and you don't use the altar or the censer or anything else for something like the hours or Compline, with a few exceptions. It's not, and in fact, most of those services are designated to be served not in the church itself, but in the narthex. And in traditional monastic churches, you have the altar, the royal doors, right? But actually, these should be called the holy doors, because these are the royal doors. And then you had, often, and in Russia you see this, a narthex.
Wow.
And in Athonite churches you see this. You know, now we have, not like St. John's doesn't even have a narthex. We've got a kind of symbolic narthex behind the two pillars, you know. You know, many churches it'll be like that. Well, you know how we go out at Liturgy at Vespers, right? We go and on the Great Feast we go and march around the church. Well, that Liturgy is served in the narthex. And the procession goes from the narthex. And so this is where, and so it was used for other things. For example, catechumens couldn't go beyond the narthex. And for example, if you go to an Athonite monastery, either in the old country or here in the United States, if you're not Orthodox, you can't go through these doors. Not just these doors, you can't go through these doors until you're baptized. And this is the entrance into the kingdom. There are whole schemas of iconography proper to each part of the church. But for example, one of the things where the services are served in the narthex, like in Athonite churches, they'll have a curtain that gets pulled across. And so there's the icon of Christ, the icon of the Mother of God, and an analogian is set up, and that's where the service is read.
Now, why is that? Why is the service, what is the meaning behind that?
Because it's only with Vespers and Matins and liturgy that ultimately you use the altar, and these are the daily cycle. In other words, it's a different level.
Right.
Now, Vitaly down here has a PhD in all of this, and I'm very embarrassed to be talking about it, but but it's very interesting, to walk into an Athonite church and here's the curtain pulled over there's doors there, but and the wall is fully frescoed, with all sorts of iconography. The hymnography of the church is primarily found in these major services, in Vespers and Matins. The liturgy doesn't change, very little. And what hymnography is that does change, that is in the liturgy, actually is pulled from the Vespers and Matins services, mostly from Matins. So you have, for example, think about it in Vespers. You have all these stachyra on Lord I Call, right? On Sunday night or Saturday night, what's the theme? What's the main theme?
Prayer.
Are we talking about Vespers?
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is the expulsion of their paradise from paradise and then the return, isn't that right? Sort of.
Well, yeah, it's the resurrection, right?
Oh, okay.
The main theme of Saturday night is the resurrection, and so you have all these hymns talking about the resurrection. Well, what are they doing? They're talking about the scriptural passages, that pertain to the resurrection. And so in Vespers you have 2 long sets of hymnography, sometimes 3, if there's a liturgy, in other words, the procession. you have what's on Lord I Call or Lord I Have Cried. Then you have the Apostica. Then you have the Liti verses along with that. Now, in good Byzantine fashion, there can be 3 or 4 different themes, 3 different themes. So, for example, if you can have the resurrection in 2 different saints. So you'll have 4 verses from the resurrection, 3 from saint number 1 and 3 from saint number 2, and the glory will be for saint number 1, and the now and ever will be to the Mother of God, as always. So the Byzantines figured out how to add, these different themes from the sanctoral cycle, from the cycle of the saints. But of the days of the week, each have a particular theme to them. Saturday night is, in other words, is the Sunday, actually. Saturday night, Sunday, is the resurrection. Monday, angels. Tuesday,
And John?
John the Baptist. Wednesday,
His when he was
Cross.
for silver.
Cross.
the cross, and,
The betrayal.
no,
Oh.
the Mother of God. Cross and the Mother of God. Thursday,
St. Nicholas.
St. Nicholas.
and the Apostles. The Apostles and St. Nicholas. Friday,
Cross.
The cross.
the cross, and
Burial.
the Theotokos again.
They took it.
And then Saturday,
Deceased.
the departed. Yeah. So this is a basic cycle. Now, if you, most of those are scriptural themes, right? Certainly the angels, scriptural. Of course, the resurrection, the angels, John the Baptist, the cross, the Theotokos also, of course, extolled in the scriptures. The apostles, St. Nicholas isn't. The cross on Friday, and the departed. Now, the departed is a very important scriptural theme. And so it's not only about a kind of nostalgic thing that we need to remember are those who have gone before us, or much less some kind of ancestor worship, but it's rather this pairing of the contemplation of death with the resurrection, right? Saturday, Sunday. And so Saturday is always is a very important day for the liturgy. Saint Basil had a rule. In the big monasteries and big churches, they can do daily liturgy. It's very hard if you're a priest alone in a one-man show. But Saint Basil had a rule of serving liturgy Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, which is the rule we had in our monastery. And I have to say, it was something I miss, not being able to do it quite like that. But Saturday has its own character to it, because here, what are we doing on Saturday? We're anticipating the resurrection. But in anticipating the resurrection, we're also remembering those who've gone before us. And so we read and remember and contemplate the Lord's words about those who have gone before us. On top of this, you have another very complex cycle. Well, I'll have a handout for next week. And that's the cycle of the feasts and the fasts. Now, there are two cycles that coincide. What are they?
Two cycles then?
There are two cycles. There's the lunar cycle and the solar cycle, right? What's the lunar cycle tied to? What feast is the ultimate feast of the lunar cycle?
Resurrection with Pascha.
Pascha, yeah. And the solar cycle, it's the daily, right? So the fixed days of the fixed dates, feasts with fixed dates. It's all about the solar cycle. The feasts with movable dates are all movable according and relate specifically to the lunar calendar. Now, what is the what I think, is it the week of the pre-feast or the pre-Lenten Sundays? What's the fast-free week?
The fast free is after the Sunday of the Pharisee.
After Sunday, yeah. It used to be in the Diocese of the West that during that week we would always have our missions conference, and so I would drive from either Point Reyes or Manton, and my favorite route was down the back side of the Sierras on Highway 395, and you could always count, because of the timing of it during the year, that there was a full moon. There's nothing like the Sierras in deep winter with a full moon. Little added benefits, you know. So now, if you look at the way the cycles are constructed, what are they doing? They're interpreting the scriptures. Now, in the Orthodox Church, think of Holy Week. Okay? Think of Lazarus Saturday. What paradigm do we follow? We follow John, the gospel, the paradigm as it's set out in the Gospel of John, right? Because Lazarus Saturday, that's the focus. And all the readings are from Gospel of John. Of course, Palm Sunday is mentioned in the other Gospels, but it's laid out very, very extensively in the Gospel of John. There's a kind of a difference in between the East and the West. In the Western Church, they think that the Passover, that Holy Thursday was a Passover meal. In the Orthodox Church, Holy Thursday was not a Passover meal. It was not a Seder. In the Western Church, it was a Seder. And that's because there's a different chronology in Matthew, Mark, and Luke than there is in the Gospel of John. We follow the Gospel of John, they follow the Synoptics. And it's not that it's mutually contradictory, because it actually doesn't say whether it was a Seder or not. It's a matter of interpretation. But the liturgical life, the liturgical texts, and how things are served and celebrated are all about making the scriptures come alive for people, so that we can enter into the living experience that is described in the text.
Isn't that partly why we have leavened bread because we follow the Gospel of John,
That's
whereas
it.
the West is unleavened bread?
That's it, exactly.
Okay.
So, and there are all sorts of various, little things like that. Now, for the solar cycle, everything is keyed off of you could say it's keyed off of the Annunciation, or off of the Nativity of Christ, or and so the cycle follows from there. Actually, it's keyed off of September 1st as the New Year, and so what's the first feast of the birth of the Theotokos? Yeah, and then it just continues on, you know, with the various chronologies. 80 days because she was female. After her birth was her entrance into the temple. Then you have the Annunciation on March 25th, and then December 25th, of course, is the Nativity of Christ. And it's all keyed around, around the fixed dates in the calendar. Whereas the whole Paschal cycle, which runs from the Sunday of Zacchaeus, which is it begins at the Sunday of Zacchaeus, which is the last gospel reading in the Russian usage, before beginning the Lenten Triodium, all the way through to Trinity's, to All Saints, which is the Sunday after Pentecost, which is a big chunk of the year. It's like a third of the year. But it actually keeps going all through the year, because you have these other cycles that are within it. For example, the cycle of the lectionary. When do we start the Gospel of John?
After
At
that,
Pascha?
after Pascha.
At Pascha,
At Pascha. Yeah.
Pascha.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the things that really separates the Paschal liturgy itself from being a historical commemoration. The liturgy of Holy Saturday, of the harrowing of hell, is a historical commemoration of Jesus rising from the tomb. The liturgy of Pascha is about the general resurrection and the second coming. It's outside. It's not tied so much to that historical reference point as the previous cycle. And then the 7 days of Pascha, where all 7 days are treated as one day liturgically. So you have this, and this is all about making the scriptures come alive. Because what happens on Pascha? You enter into the kingdom, right? And you celebrate it, at least we celebrate it for a week. Actually, we celebrate it for 50 days, but, so. And then you have the cycle, on the 40th day is the Ascension, and the 50th day is Pentecost, then they have All Saints after that. Then you go back to the Octoikos. But you also start the cycle of 8 tones with Pentecost. So that goes all the way through to the beginning of the next Lent, and actually all the way through to the next Holy Week. Because Palm Sunday is always in what tone? Tone 1? I think. So, is this helpful? Okay. But what's important to understand is how the liturgical life interprets the scriptures, not just the specific type of interpretation of sitting down and doing an expository essay or sermon, but but it incarnates the Scripture in a very unique way. So next week we'll talk about the Fathers and their interpretation of the Scriptures. What were the methods that they used? And we find all of these methods in the hymnography of the Church, and actually they're all rooted in the Scriptures themselves. You know, various other means that the Church uses to make the Scriptures kind of the central, to incarnate the Scriptures in our lives. I hope the message is getting across that the Scriptures are really, really, really important to us as Orthodox Christians, and they stand at the very core of our whole life as Orthodox Christians. Okay. All right. It's 9 o'clock. Are there any questions?
Are you going to speak about the tones?
Oh, eventually. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Mhm.
Yeah, music is also used. Yeah, Doug.
Well, I'm still wrestling with trying to understand what is capital T tradition and what is not.
Mm-hmm.
Is Pauline authorship part of the of Hebrews, part of the capital T tradition?
You know, I'm not sure. I'm not sure you could say that it is, because it doesn't say so in the Scriptures. It doesn't say who wrote it.
It does in the readings in church, though.
Yeah, it does. You know, I think the Church certainly believes that it came from Paul or from the school of Paul. But
the answer is not exactly.
Not exactly.
Thank you.
So do you go on the themes, the daily themes, Monday angels, Tuesday St. John's, does that vary from different Orthodox jurisdictions, like the Serbian, Romanian? Because in the Romanian, it was understood that like Monday were for children. Did you ever hear that?
No.
Yeah.
No. You see, one
they
of the
fast for children or something.
that may be a local practice.
Oh, okay.
There's all sorts of local practices, all everywhere.
Okay.
But all the liturgical books are all the same.
Okay. Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what the language is. That the uniformity came about, of course, starting in the 16th century, 15th century with the 16th century with the printing press. But it's the same books that are translated. It's the same Greek original text that's basically translated into all these literally hundreds of different languages that form the real core. Now, there are some that are purely local traditions. For example, the Romanian Church would have services to saints that are only known in Romania, and where they would only be written in Romanian. The Russian Church has saints that are only known in Russia, and their services would only be written in Russian or in Slavonic or something. And it's the same throughout the entire world. And so there are local saints, and then there are these kind of universally venerated saints, and then where there would be one, a common service. So, for example, probably the service to Saint Nicholas is probably the same throughout the whole world, because probably they used the original from the cathedral where his relics were, and then that became universally used. But Saint Paphnutius of the Swamp, I don't know.
The calendar that prescribes which scriptures are read each
Mhm.
week at the service.
Mhm.
Are those the same for all of the different, like for instance, the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, or the Russian Orthodox outside of Russia and OCA? Are they on any given week? Will they all be going over the same scriptures?
Depends. You've got the wild card thrown in there of the calendar. Some follow the Julian calendar, some follow the Gregorian calendar, or rather they call it the revised Julian calendar. But the basic core is the same. There are local variations.
I thought the Greek lectionary was slightly different than the Russian lectionary.
Yeah, it's slightly different, but it's basically the same. There's some of the wild cards come. There's a question of when do you jump from the Gospel of Matthew to the Gospel of St. Luke. And some churches will do that at a certain point. In other words, I think the Sunday after the cross, and others won't. So, are you all familiar with Johanna Manley's books? She has kind of the set readings according to the Sundays after Pentecost, which is the reference point for all of the readings, and so she presents those in little commentaries. They're very good. I think St. Vladimir's Press publishes them now.
What is her name?
Johanna Manley. And it's called The Holy Fathers in the Bible, I think. Yeah.
I'm kind of dovetailing on her question about the days of the week, because I had always heard that Wednesday was the betrayal, remember the betrayal.
Right.
So why would Wednesday we would remember the cross? Only because I'm thinking I've told my children the wrong thing when they ask, why do we fast on Wednesday?
Well, it's both, but the theme is basically the cross,
The cross.
in the liturgical hymnography.
Okay.
Will you please tell us about Byzantine time and where does it fall and how it's
Well, Byzantium really begins around 325. It was 325 when Constantine consecrated the church, or consecrated the city, right? Or thereabouts? 320, 325.
330. 330.
330. Ah, okay. So from the early 4th century up until 1453, when the Turks conquered Constantinople, that whole era is referred to as the Byzantine the Byzantine Empire. Now, nobody who lived in it would have called it that. They would have called it the Roman Empire, and they would have called Constantinople New Rome, and they would have referred to themselves as Romans. And so there's a Greek theologian by the name of John Romanides, who's an American actually, and he steadfastly maintains that we should not be calling ourselves Greek Orthodox, we should call ourselves Roman Catholics. Because we're the Catholic Church of the Roman Empire.
But
Technically, he's
Proud
right.
of their Greekness, though? Were they proud of that?
Well, actually, in the Byzanto-Roman Empire, no. Actually, to be called a Greek was to be called a pagan, and it was an insult. So this whole Greek nationalism thing is 19th century. On, with the which led to Greek independence, and but of course the Greek language was very important, but the language of the court in the Roman Empire was Latin.
Even in Constantinople.
In Constantinople, whereas the language of the people in Rome was Greek. And Latin wasn't used liturgically for 300 or 400 years.
Was not, or was?
Was not.
Even in Rome, you're saying?
in Rome, because most of the people spoke Greek.
But the Latin in the courts in the East, that dropped out of usage after what, like 700 or something like that, or maybe earlier?
It was all,
Didn't Justinian have a big legal reform?
No, I mean, time of Justinian, I think it was still Latin. I mean, but
Yeah.
eventually, I mean, there was a period when they were no longer speaking, no longer able to. First of all, after 700, then after, especially after 1204, I mean, when, there were no longer mutual understanding. I mean, you had to translate Latin works into Greek for some who Greeks could read it.
Well, actually, I'm wondering about daily prayer, daily services by Byzantine time. You know, what monastery and how does it relate to? For example, in the Holy Land, they serve liturgy right after midnight, right? And they said that it's by Byzantine time.
it's a very ancient custom.
Yeah, so where is it go and how it's how the whole day what the structure of the day, what schedule of the day in those monasteries, and where in the world they.
Well, Mount Athos still uses the Byzantine reckoning of time, which means that they reset their clocks every day at sunset, and that's 12 noon, or that's 12 o'clock.
12 noon?
12 o'clock
And sunset?
is sunset.
You mean midnight, 12 o'clock,
No,
or
it's,
noon?
it's 12 o'clock.
12
It's
o'clock?
12 is, sunset is 12. And
12
then,
p.m.
I don't think that I don't know if they use AM, PM. It's just
Very
12. And so sunrise on the equinox would be
12.
would be the other 12. So and so they counted their day according to, but when they refer to the first hour, third hour, sixth hour, it's the first hour after sunrise, the third hour after sun. You know, these watches. So I much more than that I don't know what to say. But it's in the monasteries of Mount Athos they use that Byzantine time. But you have to translate. In a sense, if you go there with your watch set on Western time, you're going to have to translate the time, because if they say, "Oh, the service is going to be at 8," it sounds good, 8 o'clock in the morning, right? No, it means it's at 2. So.
Yeah, I don't think I will have chance to do so.
Oh, the women's monasteries do the same thing. So.
Doesn't mean that this hours not fixed, like.
No, the hour's not fixed
Okay.
in Byzantine time.
But say during the winter time the day is shorter and then vice versa. So how do they sleep more during the winter time? Or?
Yeah, and especially like in the Russian monasteries, where the days are very, very short. So you don't have as much work day. But I wonder if that's why in the Russian usage during winter, which is Lent, they have 3 kathismas at matins instead of just 2. So, and then the services tend to get shorter, like in midsummer when there's a lot of work, and there's not as many. You don't have all the major feast days. And then after the harvest, that's when you start getting the major feast days.
How about north?
In the north,
like when white nights, for example.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. But really, the whole thing was developed and geared to the Mediterranean. So. There's things that make sense in a Mediterranean latitude that don't make sense in a Russian latitude, but.
Vladika, the prayer of the hours. you know, a lot of people, I used to think that they were really lengthy, you know, the reading of the Psalms. Actually, you know, it's 6, 9, 12, 3, 6, 9, and midnight. And the Psalms are like, you know, in 15 minutes, once you really get to, you can go through them very quickly. And the Coptic, they have is Agapia? Agapia?
Agapia, yeah.
Yeah, Agapia, yeah. That they, everybody reads through them. They actually walk one day. I attended a service, and the first thing that they did, no, you have to have this, and you need to read that, you need to understand it, and they take it really seriously. And the meaning, what I was told, just confirming with you if this is the meaning, in reading the Psalms is when you attend liturgical services and you go through confession and communion, is you are sort of sharpening the external layers of your heart, but to really uproot the sins by reading the Psalms is when you really get into the depth of the sin.
Well, there's all sorts of explanations.
Yeah,
That's
so
good.
that was their explanation to me.
So, okay. Thank you. Father John?
Shine, shine, O you Jerusalem, for the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. Dance now and be glad, O Zion, and do thou exult, O pure Theotokos, in the arising of him whom thou didst spare. His piety thus for